Your life, your relationships, and all of the things that you do are all rooted in a single fundamental factor that is the basis of your entire mind and your whole existence. And it comes down to a single word: obligation. Now, that might not sound like it could possibly be at the root of all these things, so allow me to explain. The first obligation that you have is to exist. You don't have a choice about that. You're here. You theoretically have a choice to make that stop, but that would end the mind that you are that is experiencing all of this. And since I'm talking about what the fundamental structure of the mind itself is, as long as the mind exists, it has an obligation to exist. So what this brings us to next is a sense of inertia. So inertia is that an object at rest will stay at rest. But what's interesting about the human mind is that when you have a rest inertia and you're stopped, you don't experience it as rest. You're so attuned to obligation as a need to express something in the world that when you are sitting still, it can be experienced as restlessness or as even a panic. You can have so much tension that it overwhelms you completely. So people who are asked to meditate for a really long time feel like that's an impossible task for them to achieve. So looking at the world this way, once you have that obligation to exist, then you have a body and you have obligation to feed yourself. You can at a given moment not have the obligation to do that, such as if you've already eaten. But the obligation will hit you at some point, and then that's where the obligation that is coming from the circumstances of the world turns into an action that you have to take. So you take this action, you feed yourself, and that satisfies the obligation. But then down from there, your relationships are also formed of obligations. You have an obligation to be a certain person. And in fact, you don't have a choice about it, because you could choose to not do anything. You could choose to just sit in one spot and let people think whatever they want. But then that's the person that you are, is you're the person who sits in one spot and lets people think whatever they want about you. You don't have a choice about that. And you don't have a choice about people framing who you are being a certain way in their mind, just as you frame them. When you think about the kinds of actions that they take, it creates a perception of who they are to you. And so for them to fit a certain perception, they are obligated to behave a certain way. If they behaved a different way, then they wouldn't match that perception. And so this really shows how deep the sense of obligation goes, is that it's not about being someone you're not. It's that in order to be a certain kind of person, you are obligated to take certain actions. If you wish to be an introverted person, you are obligated to not interact with people. If you wish to be an intellectual person, you are obligated to do intellectual activities, to read, to think about things, to examine the world, to examine your thoughts. If you wish to be an active person, then you are obligated to take actions, to go exercise, to ride your bike, to go hang gliding, to do these things, right? If you wish to be a monk, then you are obligated. If you wish to be a meditative person, then you're obligated to sit still and be meditative. So it might seem kind of pointless to look at the world through this lens of obligation this way, but it really goes very deep into all of the connections that we have. Because if you're talking about family relationships, if you're talking about people that you love and your connections to them, obligation takes on a very interesting form, which is that If you are living from a place of being yourself where you don't feel obligated to do the things that you do, and instead you are doing things that are so natural to you that to do anything else would feel like obligation, that's when you've transformed the energy of the world into the energy of you. You've made it into who you are. Because everybody will feel that pressure in some way. Just by existing, you have to be somebody. You have to be a mind with thoughts in a world that is changing or is not changing to various degrees, and you have to have feelings about that. Our minds love iterative patterns, essentially. So if you're listening to music, it needs to change on some level. It can have repetition, but there has to be change too. If there's too much change, it's going to just sound like chaos. It's not going to sound pleasant. If there's too little change, it's going to sound so repetitive, it'll be like hammering into your head, right? And relationships can be similar too, depending on the people. But what it comes down to with relationships is that a big part of obligation, both in society and with people, is that you're obligated to not be a certain person that other people are naturally. So maybe you're sitting at dinner, you're obligated to not jump on the table and start smashing all the dishes and screaming. If you did that, your family might be concerned, and so the obligation wouldn't push you out of society, but what it would do is it creates a different reality that everybody's now experiencing that's not this tranquil, peaceful dinner. Now is that there's somebody on the table screaming and stamping their feet around. They wonder why. They go, why are you acting this way? Ostensibly, to somebody, that is a more natural state. That's who they want to be. Maybe this person is a child. For children, they have a lot more of that energy to just get energy out in any way. And they're a little more free and loose in that sense. But as an adult, you'll find that you don't even want to do that. It would take vastly more energy from you if you were suddenly obligated to get on the table and stomp your feet and smash the dishes and yell and babble nonsense than it would for you to just sit there and talk to people about, their lives, how you're doing, your work, world events, movies you've seen, music you've listened to, things like that. And so that's where obligation and joy come into this very interesting sort of a harmony of relationship, is that you're always obligated to do something, but you're not obligated to do it with a feeling of obligation. You can do it instead with a feeling of joy. Now, there are things you have to do with a feeling of obligation a lot of the time. Like if you're going through your life joyfully and you see somebody in need of help, that feeling is not necessarily joy that compels you toward them. It's a pure sense of obligation. You see somebody drowning in a river and you just take your clothes off and jump straight in the river and you pull them out. And it's a pure feeling of obligation that ties into adrenaline. And that same adrenaline, that same sense of obligation would come from being in the wilderness and surrounded by creatures. If you're alive in the Stone Ages and you're hunting, you're very aware, you have this sense of the threat. And so if a threat occurs, you respond to it immediately. And it's a pure sense of obligation that drives the action, right? But let's bring this, this concept to a slightly different place, which is that when you've engaged that obligation at that level, say with an animal in the forest, you've expressed self. Self and obligation can be the same thing when the obligation makes total sense to you. Generally speaking, though, the rest of the time, self and joy are synonymous. And that is where the harmony of self is. And so if you're in relationships with people, they have the option to place obligations on you. They do this subconsciously and unconsciously, like we talked about where it's like, as long as you're not jumping on the table and flipping out, people kind of accept you. So they've placed that obligation on you, but you don't really care because you're not going to do that anyway. So it doesn't even feel like an obligation. To feel like you had to do it would feel like an obligation. But with our relationships, we can develop expectations. And expectations are obligations that are a form of pressure and imposition. Work has expectations, for example. At work, they expect you to come in on time and do your job and to, harmonize to some degree with the people at the office or wherever you are. And so that kind of obligation can be experienced in the same way as obligation in a forest, where you're being attacked by an animal and you just respond to it out of this natural instinct that is you. It's a survival quality of being you. You can do the same thing with a job where you have all these obligations and it's just you to fulfill them. And you don't feel it as pressure, you don't feel it as obligation, because you could be at home not having to do anything and that would feel significantly worse to you than to just do what you have to do, since you don't really have to do most of the things that you think you have to do. But if we bring all of this into relationships, that's where there's an interesting conversation to have, because the way we place obligation on each other in relationships is not just to not be like a certain person. It's also where we go, hey, if you don't act this way, I will not feel happy. I won't feel good if you don't do this certain thing. And some of it makes sense. It's like, hey, if you don't pick up after yourself, I'm going to feel bad. If you leave dishes in the sink, I'm going to feel bad, because you're putting that on me. Somebody has to do it. You can't just not want to live in a clean space. That doesn't make any sense, right? And so we have an obligation to our environments, and when we share those environments, we have to fulfill those obligations or the environment falls apart, and then we are not able to experience it as a pleasant, free-flowing space of energy. But then the next level up from there is that somebody might go, well, if you don't show me affection, essentially, then I feel bad because I don't feel loved. And the way this might work is that, let's put it in sort of the traditional romantic archetypal sense. A man in society sees a woman that he thinks is really beautiful, and so he's drawn to her, and he goes, oh man, she has a lot of guys who are interested in her, who really like her, and I know she's getting a lot of attention from them, and that they all seem like great guys, right? So I have to find a way to stand out. And at first this starts where he just notices this woman, and he's like, oh, she's so pretty. Like maybe they're at college together, and he just notices her in his classes, and so he just starts to have her on his mind. He starts to think about her. He's doing homework and she's on his mind, and he's just thinking about how she makes him feel and how pretty she is. And then so he comes to a place eventually where he says, okay, I'm gonna ask her out because I'd like to be with her. I'd like that beauty and that love in my life. And so he buys her flowers and he asks her out, and she says yes, and they start dating, and they end up in a relationship. And at this point, what can happen is that depending on the guy, he might go, well, I got what I wanted. I got the relationship I was interested in. I got the beautiful woman in my life that I was hoping for. And now it's not really in my nature to reach out this way or to do these kinds of grand gestures or to be terribly romantic. I mostly just want to sit around and watch football and hang out with my friends and then see my girlfriend when I can. And she might feel like there's something missing there. And what that might be is that she wants to still feel like she's on his mind all the time, in the way that she was before they got together, that he's still thinking about her, and it's like he's visiting the gardens, right? The gardens of his feelings and his love, and he's going up and he's smelling the flowers, and he's drinking in that perfume, and that is her essence, right? And from his heart comes this desire to express his joy and his love of that sensory kind of a palace that is her, and the expression of the feminine kind of beatific, divine, heavenly quality that a guy like that can pick up from a woman, right? So he experiences this, and what she understands that goes along with that is an expression of the heart, love, romance, some kind of a poetry of feeling, of thought, of expression, of experience, or a reinforcement of that meaning that she has, that he'll display that he's not just going through his day and not thinking about her at all. So that is another level of obligation. It's not something where she's saying you have to be this way. In fact, they could even get along and be in a good relationship without him really doing anything too overtly romantic. But for her to feel those feelings and to feel special, he's probably going to have to do something to show her that. Some people like to just sit together, though. Some people like to just be together. And maybe if they're more introverted, right? And that can be very, very healthy, to just share a rest state. And that's where you can find that state of like rest can more occur for I think a lot of people, where when you're with somebody that you really, really like, it doesn't feel like there's any need to be doing anything to be happy. You can just be sitting there and you feel quite happy, but the thing that you're doing is sharing that space and that time with them. But at the root of all of this is the sense that you know that life is essentially made of timing windows that are closing all the time. And in each window, you have to fit a certain number of things. Some of them will be pure obligation, like eating, providing for yourself, keeping yourself clean, in order to upkeep the environment in its whole state that you want it in. And then other things in those timing windows will be time that's available for you to choose what you do with it. And this is where the concept of obligation can be turned into joy. You can force yourself to feel obligated at every single moment of your life. You can have no free time to yourself, because if you're not working, you're sitting there going, I should be doing more, I should be better, I should be someone else. That's a sense of obligation you're placing on yourself. But the Japanese author, Marie Kondo, had a very interesting perspective on clutter in the home, which is that she said, if you're trying to figure out how to declutter your house, all you have to do is look at a given object and ask yourself, does this spark joy? And if it doesn't spark joy, you get rid of it. And so what you can do with the sense of obligation is you can look at the things that you feel obligated to do, and you can ask yourself, what in this sparks joy? Because if you're pushing yourself to do something, there must be something in it that's calling to you. There must be some joy in it. And so it's really important to get in touch with that, find out what it is, and express it. And additionally, this is how you also can find out what obligations are things that just don't belong in your life. Now, this doesn't mean a child or something like that, because a child is both joy and obligation. And in that case, find the joy, of course. Like, that's the only real answer to that situation. But if you're in a relationship that's optional, just ask yourself, if you feel a certain obligation from that relationship, does it spark joy in you? Does it spark joy? Because if it doesn't, you might want to explore something else. You might want to find somebody else out there who does spark joy when you're with them, and with the things that they want. Like, the things that they want from you become things you want to give them and you want to do for them. That's what a good relationship is.